side of the podium, we have KMLA 8 from government. We have a panel of 9 adjudicators. Before I go on, I would like to introduce our timekeeper, the president of KIDA, Kim Ah-young.
Pretty.
On the left side, the farthest, we have Kim Mi-young from Kyung University. And we have Lee Jun-han from Jungang University. And we have lovely Jo Won-ji from Ewha University. And we have our not so lovely DCA Kang Ki-jang from SMU. And we have Lee Gang-min, who's the vice president of KIDA from Sungkyunkwan University. We have come down to Lee Kwang-geol from Korea University. And we also have Andy Hume, who is the world champion. Next to him, a very small person, Choi Han-ju from Hanyang University. And last, and also the least, from Korea University of Foreign Studies. And also on the camera we have Logan. Right, enough for introductions. Without further ado, we are here to debate on the motion that this House would ban prisoners from publishing accounts of their crimes. Say it again. This House would ban prisoners from publishing accounts of their crimes. Now, can we have the Prime Minister come to the podium and start off the debate?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, we believe in entertaining people by publishing lots of stories. We believe that people have a right to publish many stories. However, we believe that freedom goes way too far in the cases in which criminals write stories, vivid descriptions, and steps of exactly how they committed their violent crimes. In those cases, ladies and gentlemen, the government side strongly stands that those kind of stories cannot be published. So before moving on to our argumentation, I'm firstly going to set the parameters of this debate by giving you the definitions. Firstly, we define this House as a Korean governmental agency, and secondly, we define prisoners as people who have been caught for a certain crime and sentenced to prison. And thirdly, on account, we define it as specific steps that are vividly described of how they achieved the crime and also how they were caught in the process of doing that crime. No, thank you, sir. And lastly, we define crime as violent crimes deemed by the governmental agency not appropriate to be published. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the arguments that are brought on by government side today. We have 3 arguments to bring. Firstly, about the victims' rights that are ignored and totally tarnished when these publishings do occur. Secondly, about how they can be copycat crimes due to the effect of these publishments. And thirdly and finally, about the social effects of what can happen when these kinds of stories are vividly published. So now on the first point of why victims' rights are going to be ignored. Now, prisoners publishing these stories are profiting out of a crime, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's take a look at a scenario. As if there was a woman that was raped by this criminal, but she still stays alive and she got pregnant, and that criminal comes out of jail, he writes a story vividly about how he raped her, how her expression was when he raped her, and what kind of pleasure he got out of it. that causes enormous sacrifice of that woman that was victimized in the process of that rape. And when the child of that woman is born, problems occur again when that child that is born reads stories about how his mother was raped. We see in these cases that enormous harms and massive harms that society simply cannot tolerate, ladies and gentlemen. We've told you how they write specific and vivid steps for how a man was killed and how they caused their crime. If there were serial killers such as Hamilton, BTK, or Charles Manson that wrote vivid steps to how they committed their crimes, ladies and gentlemen, we think the victims of that murder, the family members of the victims that were killed, would be sacrificing the victims' rights severely. It's insulting to the victims themselves that firstly that they had to be the object of that crime by the criminal, but it's even more insulting that that criminal gets to profit from that crime that he's created, ladies and gentlemen. So what we really have to weigh here is the profits and pleasure that this criminal is going to gain out of publishing these publishments, and the despair and destruction of the victims' rights they have, ladies and gentlemen. And on this side, it's your choice to choose which side you're going to go with, ladies and gentlemen. Criminals in our society are supposed to be punished for their crime, but by allowing these kinds of publishers, they're not being punished, they're gaining profits out of the crime that they have committed. We also see in another scenario in which in the United States there were teenagers that stoned a girl to death, threw her body in a river, and then posted the vivid stories on the internet. And there were social effects of this because some people agreed to this fact, saying, well, the woman really had to be killed, it's not your fault that you killed her and stoned her. And we see that with these kinds of social effects that might cause sensational beliefs that society might tolerate these kinds of crimes, it's even more insulting to the victims that was object to this crime, ladies and gentlemen. So that brings us to our second argument about how there can be copycat crimes that are aroused from this, ladies and gentlemen. As we've continuously emphasized, with these vivid descriptions existing about how really a crime can occur and how these violent crimes are carried out, ladies and gentlemen, and how they got caught as well. People can read this, and some people feel thrilled out of reading this crime, ladies and gentlemen, because it's a real story of how an act was occurred. For example, if Charles Manson, who has raped a girl and who has also killed a pregnant woman by stabbing her 39 times, was allowed to publish his story, vividly stating the process of which he committed his crime, we think that many other people in society, after reading this, might be having the incentives to create the same crime again. But this time, ladies and gentlemen, because the criminal also includes how the process in which he got caught, all the new criminal, the copycat criminal, really has to do is get rid of the glitches that were existent within the previous criminal's act and conduct, and then create a crime which also makes it harder for society to punish that new crime when these copycat crimes occur. A response to that.
Do you not realize the fact that the information is not only available for other people, but also crime investigation organizations too?
These are criminals that were already caught and punished. So what are they saying here by saying that the information is also available to these people who have caught them? They've already had this process of investigation in which they caught the previous murderer, but what happens, the difference between that and what happens when they publish it, is that only the victims can know what kind of glitches were existed within the previous criminal's conduct, and then just fix that. How exactly is the investigators and the police going to know what kind of glitches are going to be fixed in this case, ladies and gentlemen? That point of information doesn't stand at all. So we've told you on the government side today that we need to realize the victims' rights that are at stake here, and the enormous massive harms that can be into society when we completely ignore these victims' rights and weigh the profit and pleasure of these criminals above the despair and destruction of those victims' lives. We've also told you how in times of society, copycat crimes can occur after these kinds of stories are published, and how more likely it's going to be harder for society to punish and catch these crimes because they know the process in which the crime was caused in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. And for all those reasons, we are begged to propose.
Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 58 seconds. Thank you for that wonderful speech. We would like to have the leader of opposition start off the opposition case.
Mr. Speaker, in this debate today, the proposition is trying to supposedly help the rights of the victims by allowing the government to limit a certain group of people from having the freedom of expression and freedom of choice. That was the very analysis that the proposition side of the House gave to in this debate today. But before I move on with the rebuttals in the first place, I'd like to certainly take into account the definition that the proposition side of the House proved to in this debate today. They defined accounts of specific crimes as the steps in which the specific crimes have occurred. But what we also see, Madam Speaker, Mr. Speakers, is that the rehabilitation process of those prisoners must be also included in those criminal accounts. Is because, and the very reason is because the criminals are not only just acting for within the criminal activity itself, but also their lives in prisons and other activities that are also resulting because of those criminal acts. I have 2 points of rebuttal. Firstly, the victims' rights, and secondly, copycat crimes. Firstly, about the victims' rights. They told you that the victims' rights must be respected at all costs. What we also see, Mr. Speaker, is that the victims have the choice of choosing to have the choice of stopping access to that information if they see that is so severe to them in the first place. They can stop reading the criminal's books, Madam Speaker. They can stop accessing the media information that we see in the status quo by turning off their radios and TVs in the first place. The victims do have the choice of having the information in their mind or not. That is the very reason why we say victims' rights are also respected. No thank yous, ma'am. And then secondly, they told you about profits and how this is bad for the society. We say, however, Madam Speaker, is that the profit is only short-term in those criminal activities. That is the very reason, Madam Speaker, why we see a very narrow target of tabloid journalism. Tabloid journalism produces very juicy stories about society. That is the very thing that the criminals are doing in the status quo. That is the very reason why our analysis about tabloid journalism also affects their decisions. But then secondly, about copycat crimes. They told you that copycat crimes will be increasing if we allow the publicization of those criminal records. We see that firstly, a very small number of people actually say that those copycat crimes are justifiable. What we also see, Mr. Speaker, is that if those people are saying that those copycat crimes are justifiable, they have a preconception that certain crimes can be justified in the first place. That is the very assumption that the proposition said has to be brought to you in this debate today. But what they also failed to prove, Mr. Speaker, is that the link to real behavior cannot be occurring just because you're reading to certain information and just because you're having access to certain information. We say that the very reason we cannot prove the link between violent video games and violence is because there is no clear substantial link between those behavior and the access to information. And what do you say to that? What do you say to that?
The difference between those violent video games and real steps is that this is what really happens in today's society.
Okay. We say that we say that those kind of copycat crimes is even going to decrease in this kind of instances because crimes are even more extreme than violent video games, Mr. Speaker. There are very few people who actually allow those extreme kind of behavior and violence in their minds and accept it. I have 3 points, Mr. Speaker. Freedom, secondly, nature of criminals, thirdly and finally, right to information. While my second speaker, Judy, will talk about justification of censorship and crime investigation mechanisms. So firstly, about freedom of choice. We say, Mr. Speaker, at an individual level, the fundamental right is granted within the level of society that everyone needs to express what they need to think about and express what they believe in and otherwise. We say that this is a right that is also granted to prisoners and nuns at the same time. But it's even more important, Mr. Speaker. It's because the reason why it's more important, Mr. Speaker, is because the information that they are going to present in the first place are information about himself and herself. It's not about information on somebody else's crimes. It's about the information of his own crimes. That is the reason why, no thank you, sir, this right to expression and freedom is given to them, because it's an information about themselves. But we also see, Mr. Speaker, is that you are the one for publicizing that information. That is the reason why the freedom of expression can be also applied in these kind of cases. And that is the reason why every individual is reserved that right. No thank you, ma'am. And then secondly, about social impact and this freedom argument. We say that it sends a message the government can limit the right and the freedom of certain individuals if they see fit. We say that this kind of analysis is even going to be more justified because the people that you are trying to ban are prisoners. If we say, ladies and gentlemen, that a certain group of people who are being discriminated against in the status quo can have less rights than others, then this is certainly a violation of human rights, as the very proposition taught in this debate today. And secondly, about nature of criminals. We say, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that criminals are aware of the costs in the first place. They know, Madam Speaker, that they are not going to be enjoying the same benefits as normal citizens do, because by publicizing that information, they are conceding to the fact that they have committed crimes before. But what we also see, Madam Speaker, is that in this nature of criminals argument, we say that there is an inherent concession that those prisoners who are willing to publicize that information are willing, in the first place, to provide a certain specific information to the public. That is the very reason, no thank you, madam, the nature of criminals themselves is that firstly, they're aware of the costs, and secondly, they're willing to pay the costs if they are going to publicize that information in the first place. That is the very reason, Mr. Speaker, the nature of criminals is nature of criminals can be an argument of our side, because we say that those criminals have the right, and they are knowing that those rights can be limited if there are, no thank you sir, if they are publicizing that information in the first place. But finally, about the right to information. We say that every individual needs to know what's going on in the society in the first place, and that is the reason why we say that individual right to information must be granted in these kinds of cases. We say that there are two types of criminals publicizing information about their crimes. Firstly, about their crimes. But what we also see, Madam Speaker, is that the information giver is conceding to the fact that they're going to give that information to the public. That's the very reason why the accounts of crimes must be provided to those individuals in the first place. A fundamental assumption here is that those public who want to access that information are knowing that those criminals and those criminal accounts can be very distressing to their mindset. We see if there's a concession between those two parties, those information must be accepted. And then finally, the rehabilitation. Well, they actually excluded this type of accounts from their definition, but what we also see, Mr. Speaker, is that the criminal accounts are not just about their criminal steps and every specific step, as the proposition talks, but about rehabilitation and their life in prisons and other after effects of those crimes. We say that it says morally that how they got out of those information provides analysis about how they got out of their crimes in the first place, and that's the reason why the people in prisoners in the first place has the incentive to change their behavior. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that is the reason why mission fails. Thank you.
Thank you. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 27 seconds. Without further ado, let's move on to the Deputy Prime Minister.
What the government knows in this debate, and what the opposition seems to refuse to accept, is that there are certain things that a government can restrict, can infringe upon certain rights of the individuals for the greater social good. And what we, the government, propose to you today are the reasons why such kinds of accounts cannot be justified, and such kinds of accounts can be stopped to protect the greater social good. Now, as the Deputy Prime Minister, I will start off by rebutting their arguments, clarifying our arguments, and presenting my third and final constructive argument. Now, what did they say? Now, let me look at their arguments first. Their first argument was about the individual's freedom. Yes, we do acknowledge that freedom is important. Freedom is important, but some kinds of freedoms are already restricted for the greater social good. So, what kinds of freedom are restricted? They have given certain rights. First, the right to information. Thank you. Freedom of expression, and, well, the rights of prisoners. Well, they can do whatever they want to do. Now, let me rebut this one by one. What about the right to information? Does the public have the right to know every single thing that they want to know? Actually, no. What about bomb construction in the military? People aren't allowed to access blueprints of bombs. Although, if you finish 4 years of university in a related course, you know how to build that bomb. People aren't allowed to access that information. We are not allowed to publish that information freely. Why? Because it might incite grave social harms. What about suicide sites? We ban suicide sites. We ban suicide methods from being spread in society. Why? Because we believe that this can lead to greater social harm. We believe that accounts of their crimes are the same thing, only even worse, because they get to take someone else's life, not their own. Now, what about freedom of expression? When we deem freedom of expression goes too far as to insulting and degrading the rights of another human being or another human beings, we restrict it. That is why we ban denying the Holocaust. This is why we ban hate speech in most democratic countries. Because we believe that some human rights of some individuals are more important than the freedom of expression in some kinds of cases. And we believe that publishing an account of how you raped a woman and how you enjoyed it and how you repented about it is not exactly the happiest story to read in the eyes of that woman or any woman for that matter. Now, what about the human rights of prisoners? They say they have the right to publish. Well, they have the right to do certain things, and discriminating prisoners from that of normal people is not right. Prisoners are prisoners because they already infringed upon someone else's right. And we already restrict the rights of those prisoners. They're not allowed to go outside the prison, for example. They're not allowed to pursue economic activities while inside the prison, for example. So, banning prisoners from publishing accounts of their crimes and saying that we shouldn't differentiate between prisoners and normal human beings that didn't commit a crime, this is absurd. Now, their second argument was about the rights of criminals. The rights. Because prisoners are willing to take the costs. Well, take the cost? This isn't really a cost. They reap massive benefits. They have the potential to reap massive benefits from publishing these kinds of stories. And I'm going to show you all the kinds of benefits that they might reap in my third constructive argument. Now, their last point was about rehabilitation. How prisoners can write stories of rehabilitation. Well, we think that prisoners may write stories of rehabilitation and how they turned into better people without writing exactly how they killed that woman, how they raped that woman, how they burned down that orphanage. No, thank you. So we think that this is totally irrelevant to the topic at hand. And we embrace, well, rehabilitation accounts and how you became a better man if you don't infringe upon the right of other people and do no harm to the social good. Now, about our arguments. First, our argument was that we should care about the people, the victims, the rights of the victims that are subject to public reading about this story. This was not rebutted at all. What about our second argument? No, thank you. Our second argument was that this will lead to better crimes committed in the future, that the government is going to have trouble catching them. And it makes it easier for potential criminals to plan out their crimes because they already have a successful account. And, well, they got caught, so that's why they're prisoners. So they must have made a mistake. So if that mistake is in the account, they can fix that mistake, making it even harder for the police to catch them in the future. So this was our point. But they tried to simplify it by saying that we believe that copycat crimes will not be committed by most people. Well, this wasn't our argument.
Information.
Yes?
Where's the link between reading stories about crimes and actually committing those crimes?
I think making a bomb is easier when you have a blueprint and someone who already made one tells you about it. Now, moving on to our third argument, the social harms. We would like to assess this on 3 levels. First, the glorification of crime is possible. Already we have learned throughout history that violence and sex have a certain dark appeal over them. This is why people are glorified in Hollywood, even if they're part of the mafia, who are villains. Yet, this is fiction, and we as human beings, rational human beings, know how to tell between fiction and reality. But, well, think about the consequences of having those glorified, unbelievably dark, horrid accounts in real life. You read about a murder in the newspaper, now he writes a book about how he did the murder. Now this is ridiculous. This is glorification of crime. What is more important to note is that the prisoner can write the story in any way he wants to do. He can lie, he can glorify it, he can justify himself. We can't stop this because we don't know everything. And now, what we see is that prisoners have the right to glorify themselves for their crimes, inciting public, support for them. Now, what about social sympathy through fake accounts? Remember that these accounts, there is simply no method to verify the truth of any crime account totally, which means that they can release any version of the story to the unsuspecting public. What if they're really good writers, and it's so compelling that people actually sympathize with those violent criminals? We believe that this is of social harm. And lastly, we do prohibit excessive violence. Excessive violence such as child pornography and violence in movies that is beyond acceptable. Now, this is the case of fiction, of people made up, but this is real. On this last note, I will then end my speech. This is real blood. There are real people involved, real victims, real crimes being committed. For those reasons, we propose.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you for that compassionate speech. Now we'd like to have the Deputy Leader of Opposition on the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the proposition has been saying throughout the debate that harms occur because we allow the prisoners to publish. But curiously enough, we say that they have been wrapping the existing harms as if that occurs because we allow the publishment of account of the criminals. We say that that was simply a misrepresentation, and I would like to straight go on to my rebuttals. Now, first, they came up and told you how victims are targeted. We have 4 responses. First, they say that they were strictly elaborating their arguments under the assumption that personal information is going to be all open in that publishment. And secondly, we say they were also elaborating this under the assumption that personal stories written by criminals will bring about national sensations. And thirdly, we say that criminals are not writing killing manuals, ladies and gentlemen. They don't write killing manuals designed for you to inspire you to suddenly engage in crimes. So therefore, that was a clear assumption and misrepresentation of our case. But furthermore, we say that they came up and told you how people may agree with the criminals. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not that the criminals' account changes the people's opinions. Those people agreeing to the hideous crimes had a distorted point of view to begin with. It's not because the criminals are writing stories that they are suddenly changing their minds to agree with them. We say that that was simply a misrepresentation. Now, they secondly told you how copycat crimes will occur, but we have 3 responses. Now, firstly, we say that the information given to the criminals will be given to the crime investigation organizations too, thus making the crime investigation stronger. I will later elaborate in my speech. But secondly, we say that violent movies and video games exist too. They never told us why the publication of prisoners precisely has more effect than video movies and video games. And also, all they said was that in the case of publication, that happens in the status quo, so it will have more effect. But ladies and gentlemen, then should we ban numerous movies based on true stories since they visualize this currently happening effect? And we say that was just an assumption. Now, thirdly, they came up and told you how if you have bomb blueprints, you will be able to make bombs more easily. But ladies and gentlemen, we simply say that making bomb manuals don't really inspire you to suddenly go to a public place and bomb everywhere. Now, they thirdly came up and told you how people aren't allowed to access to every information because reading that causes you to commit social crime. But firstly, we said that, so what social harms have you been given in the podium until now? People agreeing with criminals, we said that that was a problem that existed already and not as a problem given by our side today. But we also say that victims being harmed, well, victims can not read those books if they feel offended. And furthermore, they were basing their assumptions on huge premises, and therefore, that was not the case. And secondly, they also said that criminals are different groups. But ladies and gentlemen, oh good. So are you going to send a message to the society that since they are minority, we are going to be able to limit their freedom of speech? We think that is a misrepresentation of the status quo, and therefore their argument, all four of them, did not stand. Now moving on to the substantive. Chang-Yang told you 1, freedom of choice, 2, nature of prisoners, 3, society's right to information. I'm going to be dealing with 4, justification of censorship, and 5, improvement of crime investigation. So firstly, justification of censorship. We believe that proposing this motion will principally agree that justifying censorship will be allowed and further creates slippery slope in the status quo. So, analysis A, on the principle level. Now, government is basically saying that they would ban prisoners' rights to express and freedom of choice. Now, this principally shows that they are infringing on the specific group of individuals' freedom, no matter what. Now, we say that the very fact that they are engaging with the minority's right of choice is very is irresponsible and is very unfair. Now, secondly, we say that this further creates slippery slope due to lack of standard. There's a lack of standard in the status quo in determining the criteria, and the very vague definition they said is also a problem too. They said that the publication of criminals will always be something like vivid description of what they did. But ladies and gentlemen, it was a very vague term that they give, vivid description. What is the distinction between vivid and non-vivid description? And secondly, we say the slippery slope may occur between different subjects too, because it's hard to distinguish when the victim starts to be harmed by the personal publishings. So we give you the example of biographies, where people may choose to describe in details about what happened in their lives. If the person being engaged in that story feels harmed by that statement, should we be allowed to ban those biographies too? We say that it's going to cause slippery slope into society, and that will be hard for us to distinguish what is censorship and what is not. Now, moving on to our 5th argument, which is that improvement of crime investigation will be brought under our model. We say one of the resulting benefits to the society is that we improve the crime investigation facilities. Now, firstly, we say that it provides the crime investigation organizations with access to more information. Now, this will further improve the crime investigation, and the government's response was, oh well, but they already detected them. So here's our response. Also, then, since you were able to detect them, you will be able to detect copycat crimes too. Since copycat, in their definition, was that they will be copying these steps that the former criminals took. So if you were able to detect those crimes, why wouldn't you be able to detect copycat crimes? That was a false logic that they gave you. Now, furthermore, we say that further detection of crime will be promoted under our model only, because we will base this criminal investigation process on real-life examples and the importance of detecting skills. So, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition has been wrapping something that exists already as if that harm is only unique in the case of prisoners publishing. We say that was a misrepresentation, and the motion clearly fails. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 13 seconds. Now I'd like to have the government whip on the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the government whip for today's debate, which I'm sure you already know, of course, I'll be rebutting the points that came up on the opposition speaker's side especially the 2 points that came up on the previous opposition speaker's side. Then I'd like to move on to the 3 clashes that came up on today's debate. Firstly, about the victim's right versus the freedom of expression or any kind of right the criminal has to publish. Secondly, about the social harm, which the opposition never totally rebuts properly. And thirdly, about, indeed, do we really have a right to know about these crimes? Now, firstly, they talked about, we have violent video games, we also have violent films, so why shouldn't we have violent accounts of crimes? Firstly, these are personal accounts. They're very subjective, and we can't, and they're going to be very distorted to their point of view. They could falsify and glorify what they're writing, especially if they think they're justified. It's going to be their point of view. Even if they falsify information, we'll never know. And they're going to try and justify themselves to make it sound as if it was a good thing, it was a thrilling thing, it was almost a righteous thing that they did. It's different from objectively watching the film. And not only that, we've told you that they're real life accounts. People reading them will know they're real life accounts that actually happened. Not just that, but there are victims involved because they're real life accounts. There can be people who read the account and can read the description, how they were viciously raped and how their rapists deprived pleasure from seeing her painful expression. They also talked about how about movies that are based on real life. Like, I doubt there are many movies that actually follow the very vivid description of everything that happened. But still, most of these movies aren't allowed to actually be released if they're actually infringing on the victim's right as well. Anyways, in this case, and not only that, because in the book they can be very vivid about description, and because it's very personal, it's a very different matter. Now, the previous speaker talked about how this doesn't justify censorship. She called it censorship. However, ladies, we've already told you that censorship isn't absolutely always wrong. In fact, calling it censorship is rather a distortion as well. Because we already ban excessively violent scenes from films. We already ban certain types of porn in society. When we deem it is harmful to society, excessively violent, we do ban certain things. Our previous speaker gave an example of bomb manual. When we do believe there is a harm to society, we do ban certain things. And in this case, because it infringes on rights and is harmful to society, that's why we do believe there's justification to ban it. They also talked about how it improves crime investigation facilities and procedures. But we don't really see why they need to actually publish it for the whole nation to see. It's just going to be for select people. And we already do that by having witness accounts in courts and having them actually get their accounts personally with them, directly, one-to-one. They don't actually have to publish it for the whole nation to read. No, thank you. Now let's move on to the clashes. Firstly, about the victim's right versus the freedom of expression of the criminals. Now, they dismiss the victim's right by saying, they have the choice of not reading if they don't want to. Well, why do you have to read it? The very fact that they were raped in the first place is insulting. That the whole nation reads about the account from that person's point of view, distorted accounts that falsified what actually happened. That is insulting in itself. That's like being raped twice, ladies and gentlemen. It's not only insulting to the victim, it's insulting to the victim's family. Roman Polanski's pregnant wife was stabbed 39 times by Charles Manson's little gang. And if he reads about how his pregnant wife was stabbed, and a glorified expression of it, because Charles Manson still thinks what he did was right, and what he did was for some sort of God he believes in, do you think that that's really not going to be infringing on their rights? Do we think the freedom of the criminal's expression is so important when they've already infringed on someone else's right? We've also given examples of how they're actually profiting from this crime as well. They're supposed to be punished for their crimes, but they're going to be profiting from this crime. That's even more insulting to victims to know they're actually going to gain profit from what they did. Now, the nature of this sort of personal, first-person account is that it's very likely it's going to be distorted. Because criminals that commit serial killers, criminals that go to prison in the first place do usually have a very twisted mentality. There are loads of criminals that have a very psychological problems and they think that what they did was right, which is why they commit the crime. So many of these are going to be glorified accounts of how they got thrilled from raping that woman, how they cut off the body parts of that person, looked at the blood pouring out from the limbs, and how it was very tasty for them. This kind of account justifying what they did, describing the thrill they achieved from it. And they're saying it's not going to encourage more people. It might actually edge on more people who wanted to murder their mothers to do the crime. The thing is that we won't even know if it's falsified because the victim might be dead, and because the victim's family won't really necessarily know what happened. So even if they do falsify it to try and glorify their little antiques, we'll never know whether it's falsified or not. We've told you this is going to have problems because there's going to be social sympathy. They said, it already exists. It's going to worsen the problem. That's not what we want, especially if it's publicised and the criminals get publicity and profits from it. And now, I'd like to move on to the second clash about social harm. I've already told you how a lot of these accounts are glorified and justified in their point of view, and a lot of people, there are going to be many copycat crimes. And not just that, we've told you because there are accounts of how they were caught, and it's not necessarily always going to have accounts of how they repented, people are going to be able to copy the crimes and get away with it because they know exactly where it went wrong. They dripped some blood somewhere and therefore they were caught, or the police procedures. And they keep on saying, oh, some of these books are about rehabilitation and repenting, but they're a very minority. And just because some of those books are going to be about that doesn't mean we should allow all these sensational, glorified literature to be published for the public to read. Because there is a greater harm, not just a greater harm socially, but victims' rights are infringed as well. Thank you. Now, we've already told you that because these accounts are very glorified accounts, and we'll never be able to know whether they're glorified or not, that it is going to have a very sensational impact on the people. So, freedom of expression and rights of the criminals, are these really the reasons that the opposition are bringing up today? Now, the third clash is about the right to know. They talked about how, oh, we have the right to know about things. We've already successfully rebutted that by saying right to know is restricted. The government does restrict certain type of literature, certain type of pornography, child pornography, for example, and law manuals, certain type of dangerous information that they think shouldn't be leaked to the public. So, ladies and gentlemen, today which side has the higher value? Today we have the higher value on the government side. We're talking about the victim's right. We're also talking about the social harms that will result as from these crimes. Now, all the oppositions today have really been able to rebut about the social crimes. It's like, oh, what's the link between copycat crimes and these books? But we've clearly illustrated that there are links to these sort of things. They've also said, oh, victims' right. That one person cannot read it. But it's clearly insulting, clearly infringing on that person's right if it's publicised. Not only just publicised, but distorted. How would a mother whose daughter was raped feel about that account being published, distorted to make it sound as if what he did was right? What kind of a message would it send to society? Which is why we believe on the government side we should win this debate.
Thank you. Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 27 seconds. Now we'd like to have the opposition whip on the podium.
Fellow debaters, as the final speaker for the opposition, I'd like to show you today why the proposition's arguments fall, why our arguments stand, and why we won this debate. And I'll be doing this through my 3 clashes, which are number 1, the consequences, number 2, rights, and number 3, practicality. And so moving on to my first clash, about the consequences. Now, one thing that the proposition has been repeating over and over again in this debate is about copycat crimes. According to them, if prisoners publish accounts of their crimes to the general public, then they believe that suddenly a great spurge of copycat crimes will suddenly appear. Well, as we've constantly stated throughout this debate, what is the link between the two? Let's say a person reads a murder fiction book, and he or she feels a thrill about reading that book. But what's the exact connection of that person feeling thrilled and that person carrying out that murder? The proposition has failed to clearly show why why these seemingly copycat criminals would actually copycat that act in the first place. In the status quo today, as my first 2 speakers have clearly shown, we have fiction books that have extreme scenes of gore. We have movies even based off of serial killers. In the 1960s or 1970s, America had a serial killer called the Zodiac Killer. No, thank you, ma'am. And there was even a movie made about the Zodiac Killer that described how he encoded his little killing things and various details like that. And did we see a great rise of people who wanted to be the next Zodiac Killer? No. The proposition has clearly failed to show us the link between whether or not a person reading the book will really want to carry out the crime. And so another consequence that the proposition has mentioned today has to do with about how the prisoners are going to glorify themselves. Well, we'd like to question, first of all, those prisoners have been convicted, and the general public know that they committed the murder. And in the process of writing the book and publishing the book, the prisoners are admitting that they committed the crime. And it's not like the media is going to go to extreme lengths and portray that guy as a role model for the general public. So we don't really understand why publishing these accounts would suddenly generate great sympathy for these guys and support for these people. Don't you agree, man?
So you're assuming just because they were convicted, they repent their crime? Because Charles Nance stated in court when he was convicted that he derived thrill from killing his victims.
Now, what the proposition said today was that they said that the people would glorify themselves into making the public think that their killings had a just reason and that their killings were something sacred. That's what the proposition told you today. And we're rebutting that by saying that by writing the book, the prisoners are in fact, while they might not be repenting, they're admitting to the fact that they committed the murder in the first place. They've been convicted. The public knows that they have been convicted. We don't really believe that random people in the general public will suddenly read these books and say, hey, I agree with this guy. I think it really is a sacred killing. We doubt that would happen in the status quo today. And so what the proposition has failed to rebut today is that our second speaker here came up here and she clearly explained about how this could actually play a role in crime investigations, how officers could examine this and therefore go into more detail. No, thank you, ma'am. Investigate in more detail and study about why these people commit these crimes in the first place and why these people commit these crimes in the first place. And they could go into more depth about examining the emotional causes and maybe perhaps some of the situational causes surrounding the problem. And so that's why we believe that there could actually be a benefit for the police force. And that's why this first clash about consequences has been taken by the opposition. Because we've shown you that the consequences suggested by the proposition don't really stand about copycat and glorify. And we've shown you that there could actually be something positive to get out of this. And so moving on to my second clash about the rights. Now, the proposition has stated in their speech today that the government restricts people from getting some kinds of information. And they've given examples of bomb manuals and suicide manuals. However, we'd like to question, are the murderers writing killing manuals? Are they writing books that say, how to kill a person, step A? Are they writing that? No, they're writing accounts of their crimes. And as our first speaker, Chang'an, has explained, it encompasses various things. What they feel after they committed the crime, their experience in prison. The proposition has cherry-picked one part of that book, and they've distorted it into made it represent the entire situation. However, we, the opposition, would like to say that's not the case. And that's why people do have the right to see that information, because it's not like a killing manual, or a suicide manual, or a bomb manual. Because the killer accepted the fact that he or she would publish that information, and because the fact that the readers themselves want to read that and want to get that information, we believe that they do have the right to get that information. And so another point under rights would be the victim issue. Now we would like to question, would a prisoner's book about a crime really be the next Harry Potter? Now, the proposition has been sensationalizing this problem, over-exaggerating, as if this book will be the next national hit, with everybody in the country reading it, and everybody discussing it at all times. We'd like to say that that's an over-exaggeration of the problem in the first place, and we'd also like to state, as you've clearly stated before, if the victim feels that he or she is not mentally prepared to read the book, then he or she, no thank you ma'am, does not have to read the book in the first place. And because the proposition has over-sensationalized the problem, they've given out the appearance of that book being the next Harry Potter, but we would like to say that's not the case. We doubt that that book will become a rising phenomenon. And that's why this second clash about rights has also been taken by the opposition. Because we've shown you how, in fact, people do have the right to that information. How the proposition has simply been cherry-picking examples and distorting that into their own benefit. And so moving on to my final third and short clash about the practicality issue. And now my second speaker here came up here and she talked about how there are no clear standards. What crime account books should be banned and what shouldn't we ban? What's too violent and what's not violent enough? The opposition have clearly not been able to refute this argument against how there is no clear standard to determine what the government is going to censor and what the government is not going to censor. And because while we have given substantiated arguments about this, and because the proposition has failed to refute this at all, we believe that this third clash about practicality is also a clear win for the opposition today. And so, ladies and gentlemen, what has the opposition done for you today? First of all, we've shown you how there are no inherently bad things when prisoners publish books about their crimes. In fact, we've shown you how there could be a positive thing to get out of that. And we've also shown you how if we ban these prisoners from publishing these books, how it could restrict upon their freedom of choice, and how it could restrict upon the right of people to get their information. And finally, we've shown you that the proposition's case today has practicalities issues, in which the government has no serious way to determine what is violent or not violent. And that's why we believe that we take this case today. Thank you.
Thank you. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 33 seconds. Now we're going to have the reply to the whole opposition case.
I have 3 questions to ask in this debate today. First of all, whose freedoms and rights are more important? Second of all, what are the consequences of allowing prisoners to publish their information and their criminal accounts? Thirdly and finally, what kind of message does it send to the society? Firstly and foremost, Mr. Speaker, about freedom and rights. They told you that victims' rights is critically important, and we need to respect those rights because it is so important, Mr. Speaker. But what we also heard, Mr. Speaker, is just no substantiation, but rhetoric saying that victims' rights are important. And then firstly, I have explicitly told you, Mr. Speaker, that the victims have a choice to stopping access to that information in the first place. They can stop reading books and they can turn off their TVs if they feel they are being violated. Then secondly, all of the arguments that the proposition had shown to you in this victims' rights is under the assumption that those criminal accounts are going to be a national sensation. We heard no response and any substantiation of that assertion. Then secondly, we talk about criminals' right to information and criminals' freedom to express what they really need to express, Mr. Speaker. But then what they told you is that because criminals are gaining benefits, through that right should be restricted. We say that firstly, in our nature of criminals argument, the criminals know in the first place that if they allow the publishing of information about their criminal accounts, they are going to be discriminated against society. That is the very analysis my third speaker Tendon gave you, because those are criminals, Mr. Speaker. They know that they're a social minority, and they are aware of that, and they have conceded to the fact, but they have published their information anyway. Then secondly, they have never engaged with our analysis about how those short-term benefits, how the benefits that the criminals will gain are only short-term. That was the very analogy that I and the leader of the opposition gave to you with the analysis of tabloid journalism. How they have a very narrow reading target. And that's the very reason why, Mr. Speaker, we're reserving the right of both parties, both the criminals and the victims. Victims' right to have victims' right to happiness and freedoms, and criminals' right to freedom and the freedom of expression. That is the very reason why we win this question. And then secondly, about consequences. The only consequence they told you in this debate today is about copycat crimes. All of the assumptions, Mr. Speaker, work under the link that there is a clear link between, and there's a correlation between criminals reading, certain people reading their account and certain people committing that crime, Mr. Speaker. That link was never substantiated by the proposition in this debate here. But what we also told you, Mr. Speaker, is that a very small number of people who have been already having misconceptions about crime in the first place are reading their accounts and feeling the heroic feelings that the proposition wants it to assert. That is the very reason, Mr. Speaker, only a small minority of people are applied in these kinds of consequences. And we told you that those copycat crimes are even more detectable under a system where you have all the information necessary to detect crimes. That is the very analysis my second speaker, Cutie, told you. Then finally, what kind of message does it send to the society? It sends a message, Mr. Speaker, as my second speaker, Cutie, told you about her in justification of censorship argument. Certain minorities' rights are less than others. Certain minorities' rights can be restricted if the government sees as fit. We say that justifies censorship in all cases, and this kind of censorship is even weakened, this kind of censorship is even strengthened under the proposition's model. The kind of censorship that we have seen in the status quo are having lack of standards, and those lack of standards is even going to be worsened in the proposition's model. That is the very reason, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speakers, the message that sends to the society is a negative one. Because one, governments can restrict certain people's rights, especially if they're a minority, and two, because it justifies censorship at all costs. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, at the end of this debate, the fundamental question is, Who is the side who are reserving both rights of the criminals and the right of the victims? We say that we are reserving that right in the fundamental principles of freedom of expression and freedom of choice. The motion fails. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Now let's have the last speaker on the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, when a debate gets very complicated and lots of arguments come down, really, what I'm going to do for you in this reply is I'm going to simplify this whole debate. What the opposition stood up for today is the criminals' right to profit and gain pleasure from their crime. And what the government side stood up for today is to protect the victims' rights that are going to be sacrificed once these sensational, vivid descriptions of crime are published, without acknowledging and ignoring what the victims may feel, ladies and gentlemen. Now, they talked about vagueness in our arguments and saying what really is inappropriate, what really can't be published. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the law in this society, we have many branches to decide whether it's a legitimate law or not, and the court system in the society decides whether something really is inappropriate to be published or not. So it's not any kind of a vagueness. It's not the burden of the government side to come up here and tell you exactly and draw a line where from this point we're not going to allow it, from that point we are going to allow it, ladies and gentlemen. That's what the court systems do. So we're not worried about that kind of vagueness existing. Now I'm going to talk about two categories in areas of today's debate. Firstly, the value, and secondly, the effects on society. Now firstly, onto the value. They talked about the people's right to know, that censorship shouldn't occur in all cases. We think this is nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. We've replied to this effectively by saying that censorship isn't always bad in every single case, ladies and gentlemen. We do ban things that have massive harms to society. It's not something that we don't do in today's society. We've given you examples of certain types of pornography that's banned by the government, certain types of extremely violent scenes and movies are also banned by the government, bomb blueprints are banned by the government as well. We've talked about those things because they have massive harms. That's why we banned them from being published in the first place. And they've also talked about freedom of expression, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we've given you an analysis very consistently on the side of the House by what is more important, the freedom of expression of that criminal or the victim's rights, ladies and gentlemen. We say on this side of the House that victims' rights should never be sacrificed for that freedom of choice of the criminal, ladies and gentlemen. They stand for criminal profits, we stand for the victim's rights. And I ask you, Mr. Speaker and Madam Speaker, have they really effectively rebutted to our arguments about the victim's rights? All they ever could say to this is victims are going to feel okay if they just don't read the novel. The very essence that book and publishment exists in society when other people are reading it is an insult and violation against that victim's rights, ladies and gentlemen. And they've never had any kind of engagement upon this one. So in terms of effects on society, ladies and gentlemen, we've told you that it sends a very wrong message to society that you can profit out of crime, and also it's thrilling to commit a crime. And they've never responded to this by saying, actually, it's going to send a good social message by allowing people to read vivid descriptions of murder. They haven't responded to this at all. And they've also told us that investigation is going to be facilitated. Well, we've responded to this by saying, it's not at all, because the investigators already know what the criminals did and how they were caught. Why does making this published suddenly become better for those guys to investigate? We see no link at all. They've also told us reading of this real story and acting are different. And we've provided you two links why they are directly linked. Firstly, people who wanted to commit a crime but didn't know how to, when they read these books and publishments about a real crime, they will be able to commit that crime. They're providing the means to commit that crime. Also, people justify their crime in these books, and it provides more incentives for future criminals to create copycat laws because it's justified and glorified. They think of it as a noble action. And also, ladies and gentlemen, we talked about really it's no different from violent videos. I told you this before. This is a blueprint about a crime. It can also be distorted, ladies and gentlemen. We can never prevent these kinds of publishments from being distorted in the nature of their crime, which they've never engaged in at all, ladies and gentlemen. They also talked about it's not about the entire nation reading. It's not going to be Harry Potter. It doesn't matter if this is not going to be Harry Potter or not, ladies and gentlemen. The very essence that it exists is the problem. That's what we say on this side of the house, and that leads to social glorification of a crime. So think of this, ladies and gentlemen. If your family member was murdered, would you want that book to be published about how he was murdered or not? That decides the winner of this debate.
Speakers spoke for 4 minutes and 42 seconds. The debaters may cross the floor to shake hands. And the adjudicators move to the